Hello and welcome to Corporatization and Education on Diabetes, an Ethics and Systems Perspective, presented for Arizona State University Nutrition 533, Food Systems, Ethics, and U.S. Diet. I'm your presenter, Renee Brown. I appreciate you joining today. This presentation will discuss the rising trends in diabetes, how a whole foods plant-based diet could be beneficial, the impact of education and its link between the food industry, and finally, the ethics behind policies and the need for further research to address new systems. You may have heard rhetoric such as there is a diabetes crisis or a diabetic pandemic. One reason for this rhetoric is that diabetes has increased every year since 2006 and is now affecting 1 in 5 people in the U.S., showing itself to be a legitimate health concern. Of course, as these numbers increase, so does the money spent in healthcare costs, which reflects money spent on a disease that can be prevented by lifestyle change. It has also been touted that a plant-based diet will prevent or improve the health of those with non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes. In fact, as early as 1977, it was recommended that lowering animal consumption and increasing plant foods would address the rise of degenerative diseases, which we now call non-communicable diseases. Since then, clinical trials have validated the claims that a whole food plant-based diet has statistical benefits for those with diabetes. Take this study conducted in 2009 comparing a low-fat vegan diet and a conventional diabetes diet in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Although both groups showed an improvement, the vegans showed more significant results. For instance, this 2016 study compares a conventional diabetic diet and a brown rice-based vegan diet on glycemic control. Both groups showed improvement, but contrary to the rhetoric that carbs are the culprit leading to high blood glucose, the vegans consuming whole food, complex carbohydrates had lower glycemic levels than those on the conventional diet. Since most Americans consume more animal products than needed, when they are put on a conventional diabetic diet, their meat consumption is altered. Therefore, positive effects are seen with the conventional diet, but with more significant findings when meat is eliminated altogether. Using a plant-based diet as the criteria, improved results were also seen in individuals who are at a higher risk for diabetes. In this case, it involved Latinos with minimal education and living in one of the poorest areas in California. Except with this study, the change derived from education alone, which included one class on how a plant-based diet improves diabetes, with a food tasting session, and one follow-up call per week. Significant improvement was seen in those with the education coupled with a plant-based diet versus the counterpart. This study reveals the elderly can benefit from education when dealing with diabetes. Again, only using one education session to inform participants of the negative effects of simple sugars on diabetes resulted in fewer diabetic attacks compared with those of their cohort. Other non-conventional avenues of education include the TV and commercials as seen in this study, where 15 minutes of commercials led to enough of the wrong information to increase the consumption of snack foods in children and young adults to increase a person's body weight by 10 pounds per year. The impact of empowering information goes beyond the confines of food. In fact, it is shown that just advancing one's degree from high school to a bachelor's or graduate education can improve health. When a 24-year longitudinal survey was conducted with nearly 13,000 participants aging from 14 to 22 years of age, with smoking and binge drinking being the measurables. These 4 articles reflect education as an instrument for change, not only for diabetes, but for health in general. The ethical question to address is whether the influencer has been influenced. To address this question, there needs to be a link established between education, industry, and policymakers. I have shown how a decrease in sugar lowers a diabetic attack, and as far back as 1977, the government has promoted lower meat and dairy consumption, but also sugar intake. Yet in this study, there is a dispute that the sugar guidelines are based on faulty evidence, and a challenge is made to policymakers to readdress the issue. Notice that under the disclosure section, some of the funding came from ILSI North America and from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Notice the name of one of the researchers, Dr. Johnston. The research article just shown, entitled Scientific Basis of Guideline Recommendations of Sugar Intake, reveals that there is a link between Dr. Johnston, ILSI, a government agency, education institutions, and industry. To connect these pieces, we will look at ILSI first. Here is the ILSI website. Scrolling down to the board members section, notice there are 12 board members on this nonprofit organization, and 3 are retired. With 9 active board members left, 8 of them are employed by a university. Going back to our organizational chart, I will insert that ILSI is led by leaders in academia. Here is ILSI's tax information for 2016. On page 4, there is a list of donors, all of which are food companies that would gain if science proved or condoned their unhealthy products. Among these, you can see Kellogg, Hershey, Kraft, Dr. Pepper, Starbucks, and more. This right-hand column, you can see other entities, one of which is the United States Department of Agriculture. Jumping to page 36 and 37, notice, as I scroll down, there are many universities receiving grants from ILSI, and ILSI is receiving their money from big players in the food industry. Scrolling back up to page 36, notice that one of those universities receiving money from ILSI was Texas A&M. Adding information into the puzzle, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is taking our taxpayer money and making donations into a nonprofit that has invested interest with the food industry. This nonprofit is called ILSI and is made up of primarily individuals working in higher education, receiving money from the food industry leaders who have invested interests. Then we see that ILSI is taking the money received from the food industry and donating it to universities. One such university is Texas A&M, which leads us to Dr. Johnston and back to the sugar article we looked at earlier. Dr. Bradley Johnston is an associate professor at Texas A&M, University of Nutrition, and director of evidencebasednutrition.org. Johnston was co-author of the research article Challenging the Sugar Guidelines, which we looked at earlier, and noted that it had received funding from ISLI, whose donors are Hershey's and Dr. Pepper. Johnston went on to author his own paper on how consumers should not worry about eating red meat and its effect on health, since the science associated with it was faulty. Johnston initially did not disclose he received funding and payments from ILSI and later added it into the Annals of Internal Medicine ILSI's connection with McDonald's and other food organizations brings into question the funding Dr. Johnston received for his research. Another point to remember that ILSI gave money to Texas A&M AgriLife, only compiling another unethical conflict of interest. Johnston's article condoning red meat is contrary to what has been presented in regards to metabolic diseases such as diabetes, and the science showing that lowered animal intake or none at all shows significant improvement on health. As you can see, there is a connection between universities, ILSI, and the food industry and the research that is being published. The real dilemma from a food systems perspective and metabolic diseases such as diabetes is the policies these connections are resulting in. Remember the sugar article calling for policymakers to take action. Well, the U.S. Right to Know has laid out how ILSI's goal is to influence policies and thus food systems, even as far-reaching as the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. And according to the New York Times, policymakers, 183 of them, have no problem unifying with corporations with insider trading, making millions off of knowing information ahead of the market. According to this article, it is clear that food policies have been shaped by government based on their connection with industry. Putting all these puzzle pieces together, it has been shown how a whole foods plant-based diet and lower sugar intake improves the health of individuals, especially for those with diabetes and those who are at higher risk. Education plays a role in the improvement of diabetes and overall health, of which universities are a large influencer for change. Unfortunately, some universities are engaging in conflict of interest when doing research, accepting money from front groups like ILSI who receive money from food industries, resulting in articles contrary to already established science on health as it relates to meat and sugar. ILSI is reaching out to government entities and policymakers to influence the guidelines that will benefit industry's bottom line. As it has been shown, policymakers are engaging in conflicts of interest just as much as the universities. These policies will only further the epidemic of diabetes and overall health as consumers try to sift through the contradicting information. With higher ed institutions being such an influencer for social change and their union with the food industry, it is no wonder the health of Americans is not getting better, but worse, with information being presented as science. It only strengthens Weber's perspective that universities will sing the tune of him whose bread I eat. In conclusion, my research is limited, mainly looking at one institution and its research in connection with industry and government policy. Certainly more research needs to be done to identify how far-reaching the university connections are with ILSI and its effects on research. The goal was to open the door for discussion and to address these unethical concerns and to discuss solutions on a more transparent and safe food system that is based on science, that has not been put forth with a conflict of interest at its foundation, as well as how lawmakers can be held accountable for their part in this current system. I encourage you to take a look at my references and further the research to increase awareness in hopes of a solution for the health and safety of all. Thank you.